It was still dark when Miriam opened the shutters to her room, her hands trembling slightly from anticipation rather than cold. The crisp morning air slipped inside like a whisper, brushing against the lace curtains her grandmother had stitched long before she was born. Outside, the mist rested gently over the fields, and the outline of the wooden fence she knew so well stood quiet in the distance. But this morning, the silence wasn't ordinary. It was expectant, almost holding its breath. In her chest, her heart pounded not with fear, but with a clarity she had never known before. Today was the day she had chosen. Not the community, not the elders, not her father's sermons or her mother's soft warnings whispered over late-night tea. She had chosen him, and she was ready to become his wife. Miriam had met Alexander by pure accident, though in her heart she had come to believe it was something deeper, something meant. He wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be flying across oceans and sitting in leather chairs and signing documents that moved millions. Not turning down a dusty road in Lancaster County because his GPS had failed, not knocking on her father's barn looking for directions when the rain made his car skid. But he had been there, soaked to the bone in a suit that didn't belong to the countryside, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the same beam Miriam leaned on every evening while watching the sunset. He had smiled, and she had offered him shelter without asking permission. That was the first time. He had come back the next week, and again after that. First with polite words, then with stories, and over time, with silence between them that said more than language ever could. He never touched her, not even once, but in her mind, she had memorized the weight of his gaze, the way he looked at her as if she were the only truth in a world full of noise. She had grown up believing that love was obedience, that love was silent endurance. But with him, love had become a voice she didn't know she had. And now, after months of letters hidden in flour sacks and early morning conversations near the pasture before sunrise, he had asked her to come with him. Not just to leave, but to marry him. In the world beyond the fence. In a world with electricity and mirrors and people who didn't whisper behind curtains. She had said yes. Her mother had watched her closely for weeks. Nothing in her expression changed, but there was a shift in how long she lingered near the door after prayers, how often she checked the hem of Miriam's dresses or asked her to recite verses she'd known by heart since she was 12. Miriam didn't say anything. Neither did her mother. But both of them felt it building, like a storm pressing its weight into the sky. Miriam had never said his name aloud in the house. And yet her mother knew. They always knew. The women, the mothers, they noticed things before the elders ever did. She had hoped her mother would let it pass. That her silence meant permission, or maybe fear. But that morning, Miriam would learn what silence really meant. She had packed her bag with trembling hands, folding her modest clothes neatly, as if she were still under the rules of the ordinal. She didn't plan to wear them where she was going, but it felt right to carry them. She placed the note carefully under her pillow, addressed only with, "Forgive me." The sun had not yet fully risen. Alexander would be waiting near the edge of the forest, where the Amish land faded into the unpaved road that led to town. His black SUV would be parked behind the tall evergreens. He had told her it was the last time he'd come, not out of impatience, but out of respect. He didn't want her to choose with hesitation. She had assured him she wouldn't. As she stepped quietly toward the front door, careful not to let the hinges creak, she stopped. Her mother was standing in the kitchen, her back to her, slicing bread. The knife moved slowly, rhythmically. Miriam thought of turning back, of waiting another day, another week. But her bag was already in her hand. Her promise already made. She walked toward the door anyway. Her mother didn't speak. She only wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward Miriam. For a moment, Miriam thought, hoped, she might say something kind, something final. But instead, her mother gently took the bag from her hand and placed it on the floor. Then she reached for the scissors. They weren't hidden. They sat on the wooden table next to the loaf of bread and the jar of jam. Her mother lifted them as if she were going to mend something. And in a way, she believed she was. Without a word, she motioned for Miriam to sit. Miriam didn't move. Her throat was dry, and her legs felt like they would fold. Her mother looked into her eyes, not with anger, but with something deeper. Grief. Quiet and aching. Miriam sat. The scissors didn't make a loud sound. Only a crisp, cruel whisper as they slid through her thick braid. Her hair fell to the floor in heavy loops. Her mother didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She only kept cutting. Not brutally, but methodically, like someone tending to a task that had to be done before dusk. Each snip was a sentence. Each curl that dropped was a gate closing. When she was done, she stepped back and placed the scissors on the table. The silence in the room was so deep it felt like a scream. Miriam reached up and touched what was left. Her crown, her identity, her pride, gone. She didn't cry. Not then. Her mother picked up the hair from the floor, wrapped it in a cloth, and placed it in the stove. She didn't wait for the fire to build. She simply watched until the first strands began to curl, blacken, and vanish. Miriam stood there, unmoving. In their world, a woman's hair was not just hair. It was honor. It was submission. It was future. No one would marry a girl who had cut her hair outside of widowhood or punishment. And every woman in the community would see her now as marked, as someone who had crossed a line and had been returned with shame. She wasn't angry. That surprised her. Miriam didn't feel rage or even betrayal. She felt the end. A closing of something she had carried in secret for months. Her mother didn't yell, didn't plead, didn't invoke God or scripture. She had only acted. That was how the women here controlled things. Not with loud words, but with irreversible gestures. Her mother had spoken with the scissors. Alexander waited for 2 hours at the edge of the forest. He didn't call. He had never once pressured her. He only waited. Then, as the morning turned to afternoon, and the birds quieted, he started the car. He drove away slowly, still looking back at the trees, hoping she might appear. But she didn't. In the weeks that followed, Miriam didn't leave the house. She wasn't shunned, but she was avoided. No one asked what had happened. They didn't need to. Her short hair said enough. At night, she sat by the window, combing what was left, letting it grow again in silence. She still thought of him. Of the way he had looked at her like she wasn't invisible. Of the life he had offered. A life she had almost held. But now, all that remained was the echo of scissors in a quiet kitchen. And the image of a man she loved driving away from a woman who never came. In the days that followed, the air around Miriam thickened with a silence that wasn't peace. It was the heavy quiet of something broken, of something irreversibly taken. Her feet still traced the same dirt paths to the well, to the barn, to the rows of vegetables behind the house. But her presence had changed in the eyes of everyone. The women who used to nod politely now lowered their gaze as she passed. The children didn't come as close when she sat on the porch. Even her younger sister, who once begged to braid Miriam's long hair, now stared at her with a confusion she didn't have the words to voice. And still, no one spoke about it. Not in front of her. Not openly. But she could hear the truth in the way their voices paused when she entered a room. In a community bound by unwritten rules and spoken scripture, shame didn't have to be declared. It was simply lived. Her mother resumed her chores as if nothing had occurred. The breakfast was still prepared before the sun broke over the hills, the laundry still flapped along the clothesline like prayer flags, and the sewing needle still moved with perfect rhythm through fabric after dinner. But something inside the house had shifted. The warmth had thinned. The quiet was no longer comforting but cold. Miriam found herself waking before the rooster, slipping out to the edge of the field just to breathe where no one was watching. She'd stand in the same place where Alexander once stood, where he had smiled and called her brave for daring to speak her truth. But now, the wind only carried the echo of her choice and the price she had paid for it. She often replayed the moment her mother cut her hair. Not the sound, not even the feel of the scissors. What haunted her most was her mother's face. Not angry, not cruel, just tired. As if she had been holding a rope too tightly for too long and finally decided to let go in the only way she knew. Miriam began to wonder if her mother had once stood where she stood now, heart full of a love the world around her would never accept. Perhaps that had been buried so deep beneath years of obedience and expectation that even the memory no longer had words. But Miriam knew. The silence in her mother's eyes was too specific. It was the silence of a woman who had made a different choice once, and never spoken of it again. Each night, Miriam wrote in the margins of an old hymnal she kept under her mattress. Not love letters, not confessions, but memories. Memories of the first time Alexander laughed when he saw her struggle to explain an Amish proverb. Of the way he always paused before touching the gate, as if asking permission. Of how he never rushed her, never mocked her questions about the outside world. She wrote down what she had felt. Because she knew that someday, when her hair had grown back and the whispers died down, those pages might be all she had left that was truly hers. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. He had promised not to come back unless she sent word. And now, with her hair shorn and her place in the community made clear, there was no longer a path wide enough to cross the divide between her and the world he came from. The elders resumed their visits in the following weeks. Under the guise of prayer meetings and scripture readings, they came to restore order, to reaffirm her place among the faithful. They never mentioned Alexander. They never had to. Their words circled obedience, humility, and the dangers of vanity and worldliness. Miriam sat through every session, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. But inside her, something was different. She no longer felt like the girl they were trying to shape. She felt like someone who had already chosen, someone who had tasted what it meant to belong to herself, even if for just a moment. She didn't argue. She didn't rebel. She simply let them speak, while inside her, she rebuilt the pieces of what had been taken. Work became her refuge. In the barn, among the silence of the animals and the hum of daily labor, she found clarity. Every motion was familiar. The worn wood of the pitchfork, the soft breath of the cows, the rhythm of milking, all of it steady, grounding. But her mind always drifted. She imagined Alexander walking the polished halls of some office building, his mind far from the slow churn of rural life. She wondered if he still thought of her, if he blamed her for not showing up, if he understood what had happened. Sometimes she hoped he didn't, that he believed she had simply changed her mind. It was less cruel than the truth, that her choice had been stolen in a single motion of steel against hair. One morning, while gathering eggs from the henhouse, she found a small wooden box wrapped in cloth near the corner beam. Tucked beneath it was a note. It wasn't signed. The handwriting wasn't Alexander's. But the message was unmistakable. It simply read, "Not all cuts are punishment. Some are shields. When it grows again, choose who sees it." She stared at the words for a long time. The box contained a small comb carved from walnut, polished to a smooth finish, and beside it, a single silver pin in the shape of a leaf. She knew without asking that her mother had placed it there. It was not an apology, but it was an opening. A fragile, trembling thread of something unspoken, recognition. Miriam didn't take the box right away. She left it where it was, returning to it over the next few days like a prayer. She thought about what it meant for a woman raised in silence to speak through gesture, to offer something that couldn't be said aloud. And slowly, something in Miriam softened. She wasn't ready to forgive, but she was willing to see that not all wounds bled on the outside. Her mother's world had been carved by rules she never had the strength to break. But Miriam had, even if she had paid the price for it. Weeks turned into months, and as the trees shed their leaves and the fields were harvested, Miriam's hair began to grow. First just enough to brush her collar, then longer still. She kept it hidden beneath her cap, but each evening she would untie it, comb it gently with the walnut comb, and watch its shadow in the mirror she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. It wasn't vanity. It was remembrance. A quiet, persistent rebellion against the stillness that tried to settle inside her. Her heart remained unsure. She didn't know if love like that could return. If a door once closed could open again. But she held to one truth, that she had loved freely, and had not been wrong to do so. And that, no matter what her reflection said now, she was still the same girl who had whispered yes in the field. The one who had believed in a life beyond the fence. The one who had seen a world where choice wasn't a sin. And in the quiet of her room, beneath the hum of lantern light and the distant songs of night insects, Miriam pressed her palm to her chest and reminded herself. The hair may have been taken, but the promise was still alive. Hidden. Growing. Waiting. By the time spring thawed the edges of the land and the first crocuses pushed through the frost-bitten soil, Miriam had learned to live within a rhythm that no longer belonged fully to her. The world around her had returned to its routines, planting, mending, gathering, worshipping, but Miriam moved through it like a ghost whose presence was both familiar and changed. Her steps were steady, her words few, her gaze calm. Yet underneath the surface, something pulsed, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably alive. The girl who had once dreamed of open roads and soft city lights had not disappeared. She had only gone silent, waiting beneath the surface like seeds beneath snow. Alexander had vanished from her life with the same grace he had entered it. No letters arrived. No messages through distant neighbors. He had kept his word. There would be no second attempt to rescue her from the world that claimed her. But still, Miriam felt him. Not in the physical sense, but in the way memories took root in muscle and breath. She could still feel the warmth of his coat against her arm when they sat too close on that hidden bench near the old mill. Still recall the scent of his cologne clinging to her fingers after she'd once brushed her hand across his jacket in secret. He had become a part of her, not through possession or promise, but through presence, through the way he had seen her and never asked her to be less. The community's judgment had cooled into a quiet tolerance. They no longer whispered when she passed. They no longer stared. But neither had they forgotten. Miriam's place had shifted from one of belonging to one of observance. She was not excluded, but she was not fully embraced. The elders had stopped their visits, satisfied that the fire had been extinguished, that the wild spark in her had been smothered by the weight of consequence. Yet they misunderstood what silence could mean. They believed silence was surrender. But Miriam had come to understand it as a form of strength. Her silence wasn't submission, it was survival. As her hair grew longer, curling once more along her shoulders beneath her cap, she began to collect pieces of herself in secret. She visited the old mill house more often, not to meet anyone, but to remember. She carried the comb her mother had left, wrapping it in linen and tucking it deep within her apron. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, no signs of the world outside, yet inside her bloomed a defiance so quiet it didn't need to be declared. Every evening she sat at the edge of the pasture watching the road she never traveled, and though she never expected to see his car again, she watched anyway. Not in hope, but in remembrance of who she had been when she first looked down that road with courage in her chest. One Sunday afternoon, as the congregation gathered beneath the large oak for prayer and reflection, Miriam sat in the second row with her family. Her mother's posture was perfect beside her, her father's hands folded over his worn Bible. The wind stirred the pages as the bishop spoke of obedience, of tradition, of the dangers of opening hearts to the wrong kind of love. Though no names were spoken, Miriam felt the words press against her skin like cold rain. She did not flinch. She did not lower her gaze. Instead, she looked at her mother. For a fleeting second, their eyes met, and in that space, there was no judgment, only understanding. Her mother turned back toward the bishop and said nothing. That was enough. Life within the community was predictable. The weeks moved through the motions of planting, harvesting, mending, and worship. Miriam resumed her work as if nothing had ever happened, but she no longer found peace in the repetition. Her hands moved out of necessity, not out of belief. She still prayed, still followed the customs, still dressed with modesty and purpose. But the connection that once tethered her to that life had frayed. She was still present, but her soul had begun to inhabit a space beyond fences and barns and silent dinners. A space where choice still lived. Her younger sister, Ruth, had begun to ask questions. Not about Alexander, not about the hare, but about the world beyond their land. Miriam answered gently, never betraying the rules of silence, but guiding her sister's curiosity with care. She saw herself in Ruth, saw the same hunger for something unnamed, the same quiet ache in her gaze when they watched travelers on the distant road. Miriam feared for her. Not because she didn't want her to dream, but because she knew what it cost to chase those dreams. Still, she didn't warn her away. She only taught her to see clearly, to carry both truth and consequence in her hands before choosing either. One afternoon, while tending to the horses, Miriam found a note hidden beneath the saddle blanket in the far corner of the stable. It was scrawled in haste, unfamiliar handwriting, but the message was clear. He's in town. One day only. There was no signature, no date, only that sentence. Her pulse quickened. The note could have come from anyone. It could be false. It could be a trap. But Miriam didn't question its purpose. She knew, instinctively, that the message was about Alexander. That someone, perhaps a shopkeeper, perhaps a traveler, had remembered her story and left behind a whisper of possibility. For the first time in months, the air felt alive again. She didn't run. She didn't pack a bag. She simply walked the next morning as she always did, through the fields, down the path that curved behind the trees, until she stood at the edge of the road. Her dress was plain, her cap in place. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything had changed. But inside, her heart beat like thunder. She waited for hours. The sun rose high, then dipped low. Wagons passed, children laughed in the distance, but the road remained empty of him. Still, she did not leave. Not until twilight bled into dusk and the shadows stretched across the earth like long regrets. She returned home with dust on her hem and silence in her throat. That night, she did not write in the hymnal. She sat by the fire instead, her hands folded in her lap, watching the flames dance like memories she couldn't touch. Her mother brought her a cup of tea and set it beside her without a word. They sat together like that for a long time, two women shaped by silence, by choices they never fully made alone. Miriam didn't speak of the note. Her mother didn't ask. There was nothing left to explain. Only the ache of what might have been, and the quiet grace of surviving it. In the following days, Miriam returned to her routines. The note was burned, its ashes scattered with the rest of the waste in the kitchen stove. But something in her had changed. Not in hope, not in longing, but in clarity. She no longer waited for the road to bring him back. She no longer watched the trees with the same ache in her chest. She had loved. She had chosen. She had lost. But she had also endured. And in that endurance, she had found a strength the community could not see, a resilience that could not be shamed. She began to write again, not just in the hymnal, but on scraps of paper she tucked into the corners of her room. Thoughts, prayers, promises. Not for him, not even for herself, but for the girl she used to be. The one who had dared to believe that love was worth more than obedience. The one who had stood at the edge of the world with her heart open and her hands unafraid. She wrote to remember her, to make sure she was not lost beneath the layers of silence and survival. And when she closed her eyes at night, she no longer saw Alexander's face as clearly. But she saw the life they almost had, the one they'd built in whispers and glances. A life she would carry forever, not as a wound, but as a reminder that she had once been brave. That she had once chosen herself, even when the world chose against her. Spring gave way to summer with an indifferent ease, and the landscape of Lancaster County swelled with life. Fields thick with green, horses moving lazily under the sun, clotheslines dancing in the warm breeze. But within Miriam, the season passed differently. Time no longer felt linear, but circular, like each morning brought her back to the same place she had begun. She woke before dawn, tended the animals, prepared meals, stitched garments, joined the congregation, all the tasks of an obedient daughter. And yet none of it reached her fully. She existed in function, but not in fullness. Her days were filled, but her spirit drifted, as if tethered to a thread stretched so thin it was invisible, yet unbroken. Though she no longer waited by the road, and the name Alexander was never spoken aloud again, his presence lived in the quiet corners of her mind. Certain smells, leather, cedarwood, coffee, carried fragments of his world. The smallest details triggered recollections she could not control. The feel of a city map folded into her apron pocket, the weight of a pen he once handed her, the faint warmth left on the wooden bench after he stood. She never allowed herself to wallow in the memories. She merely acknowledged them, like ghosts that passed gently through her, neither welcomed nor denied. They were part of her story, just as her shortened hair and silent mornings had become. Her mother had returned to her old rhythms with a steadiness that Miriam both resented and envied. The older woman moved through each day as if time and memory were tools to be folded neatly beside dishcloths and recipe cards. But Miriam knew it wasn't forgetfulness, it was survival. Her mother's silence was not born of ignorance but of wisdom, carved over years of quiet sacrifices too painful to name. Miriam had begun to recognize that the scissors had not only severed her hair but had also bridged something between them, a lineage of women taught to destroy parts of themselves in order to remain. It was not forgiveness she felt, but a kind of ancestral recognition, heavy and raw. The community, for its part, continued its subtle surveillance. Miriam's obedience had been noted, but trust was never fully restored. The young men no longer courted her, the mothers no longer included her in whispered matchmaking conversations. She was still present, still respected in appearance, but her desirability as a wife had been quietly extinguished. She had become something else now, a cautionary tale told through glances, a girl who had once nearly left. That kind of wound never healed in a place like this. It simply became part of the air everyone breathed and no one addressed. One morning, while helping her aunt prepare preserves in the neighboring farm, Miriam overheard a conversation between two older women speaking in low tones near the pantry. They spoke of a man from the city, wealthy, quiet, traveling alone, who had been seen near the train station weeks ago. The details were vague, the timeline uncertain, but Miriam's pulse quickened all the same. She pretended not to hear, her hands steady as they sealed jars of jam, but her mind ran wild. She didn't allow herself the indulgence of hoping it was Alexander. She only stored the information the way one stores dry wood before a storm, quietly, for later, when fire might be needed. That night, she opened her hymnal again. The pages had become worn at the edges, the ink slightly smudged from time and oil. She didn't write about him anymore, but she did write about the shape of longing. Not for him specifically, but for freedom, for expression, for a life in which love was not treated like a disease to be purged. Her entries had matured, less poetic, more precise. She wasn't the same girl who had once stood barefoot in the grass whispering yes. She was older now, harder in some places, but still intact. And though she told herself she had moved on, her heart still beat differently when the wind shifted from the west, carrying the scent of pavement and diesel and the distant promise of another world. In late August, during a heat wave that turned the soil to dust and slowed even the horses to a crawl, a letter arrived. It came not by post, but slipped beneath the back door in the early hours before sunrise. The paper was folded tightly, no envelope, no signature, just one line, handwritten in familiar script. One more time. If you choose it. Miriam stood in the kitchen with a letter in her hand, the dawn just beginning to stretch across the fields outside, the world still hushed in slumber. Her fingers trembled. It had been so long since she'd seen his handwriting that her body remembered before her mind did. She didn't weep. She didn't collapse. She simply stared at the words until the kettle whistled and broke the spell. She didn't respond. She didn't run. She didn't confide in anyone. She simply went about her day, but with a quiet fire lit behind her eyes. Her heart no longer raced wildly. It pulsed with a steadier beat now, one born not of youthful fantasy, but of mature defiance. She knew what answering the letter would mean. She knew it would not be received as romance but as rebellion. And this time, there would be no forgiveness handed to her in the form of second chances or softened glances. If she chose him now, she would be choosing exile. Not just from her family, but from her entire world. Her decision took root slowly, beneath days of sweat and labor and prayer. She worked the fields beside her father, without faltering. She sewed dresses with her mother in measured silence. She tended to Ruth's questions with the care of someone who knew what it meant to wonder and ache. And still, she thought of the letter hidden beneath the floorboard. She recited its single sentence like scripture, tasting each word, weighing its cost. She no longer dreamed of escape in the way she once had. Now, she saw it for what it was, not a rescue, not a fairy tale, but a fracture. When she finally pulled the letter from its hiding place and read it once more under the weak light of her oil lamp, Miriam didn't smile. She didn't cry. She only folded it again, pressed it against her chest, and closed her eyes. She thought of her hair, now brushing her shoulders again in waves that had once been cherished. She thought of her mother's hands, trembling only once, when she had set the scissors down. She thought of the long, dust-covered road, the man waiting at its end, and the price she had paid the first time she failed to walk it. She rose the next morning before dawn, dressed in the plainest garments she owned, tied her hair beneath her cap, and stepped out into the misty fields alone. Her breath was calm, her steps unhurried. She was not running this time. She was walking toward a truth she had buried for too long. Whether he would be there or not no longer mattered. What mattered was that she would show up, not for him, but for herself. The girl who had once been silenced by scissors and shame was now standing again, whole, silent, but no longer afraid. The morning Miriam chose to walk again toward the outer edge of her world was not marked by any celestial sign or grand farewell. It was quiet. The kind of quiet that folds around a person who knows what must be done. The fog had just begun to lift. The sky still held the dull gray of early dawn, and the dew soaked the hem of her dress with every step she took through the fields. There was no bag in her hand this time, no letter hidden under her pillow, no borrowed perfume dabbed at her wrist. Only the rhythm of her breath and the weight of decision pressing steadily in her chest. She moved as someone who had been here before, but carried none of the trembling uncertainty that once guided her path. The world she walked through had not changed, but Miriam had. Her feet followed the same winding route along the fence line, past the rows of harvested corn, through the thickets where wild berries still clung stubbornly to their stems. Every step was familiar, but each one felt different now, as if the land itself sensed what she carried in her heart. The last time she had taken this path, she had done so with hope that someone else might save her from the silence she had been born into. Now, she walked without expectation, knowing that no one could offer her freedom she hadn't already begun to claim for herself. She didn't need Alexander to pull her into another life. She only needed to stand in the place where she once hesitated and know she would not turn back again. When she reached the edge of the forest, where the trees grew tall and thick and the shadows still clung to the earth like secrets, she paused. The clearing beyond was empty. The long gravel road that connected the boundaries of her community to the nearest town stretched out in both directions, quiet and still. There was no black SUV waiting this time, no figure leaning against the doorframe with gentle eyes and patient silence. She had not come with certainty that he would appear. She had only come to face the choice again, to walk the road she hadn't dared to before. She stood there for a long time, listening to the birds begin their morning songs, the rustle of wind through leaves, the slow ache of memory crawling through her ribs. Eventually, she turned and sat on the moss-covered log at the clearing's edge. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers lightly interlaced, the letter tucked deep in the pocket of her apron like a heartbeat. The sky above shifted slowly from gray to blue, the light filtering down through the canopy in soft beams. Time passed differently in that space, and Miriam let it. She didn't search for him. She didn't strain her ears for the sound of tires on gravel. She simply sat, breathing in a place where the world she was born into could not reach her, even if only for a moment. When the sound finally came, it was distant at first, a low hum barely distinguishable from the breeze. But it grew steadily, each second drawing it nearer, more defined. She didn't move. She didn't rise. She let the sound come to her, let the dust trail rise at the bend in the road like a slow reveal. And when the vehicle appeared, sleek and dark against the gold morning light, She felt no shock, no flood of overwhelming emotion. Only the quiet knowing that sometimes the world circled back to what had once been unfinished. The car stopped a few feet away, the engine went still, and the door opened without hurry. Alexander stepped out, dressed simply this time. No suit, no tie, just a light shirt with sleeves rolled and the same quiet presence he always carried. He didn't speak. Neither did she. There was no need. The silence between them had always been its own language, and now it filled the space like an old friend. Miriam stood slowly, brushing her hands along her dress, not out of nervousness but from grounding. She stepped forward until they stood a breath apart. And for a moment, the two worlds that had been torn apart by scissors and fear hovered in the same fragile place. He did not reach for her. She did not move to embrace him. Instead, they stood still, acknowledging the vastness between them and the bridge they had yet to decide whether to cross. The minutes that followed were filled with few words but deep understanding. He did not ask why she hadn't come before. She did not ask why he had waited one last time. There were no demands, no ultimatums, only presence. And in that presence, Miriam felt something loosen inside her. Not the ache of love rekindled, but the acceptance of her own capacity to return to a place of pain and not be destroyed by it. They spoke quietly. The kind of conversation carried more in glances than in sentences. He told her of the years that had passed, the cities he had visited, the empty spaces he'd carried her memory into. She told him little, but what she did say mattered. Not because of the details, but because she spoke them without shame. They didn't speak of what would happen next. He did not ask her to come with him. She did not offer. The question was too large to answer in a morning. But when he offered her a ride back to the edge of her land, she nodded. Not because she needed the ride, but because she was willing to let him see the world she came from one last time. This time not as an outsider peering in, but as a man permitted to witness the quiet resilience she had built from ashes. The drive was silent. No music, no chatter, just the sound of tires rolling over gravel and the occasional birdsong carried in through the cracked window. When they reached the point where her land began and his world ended, the car slowed to a stop. Miriam stepped out, the ground familiar beneath her feet, and turned to face him through the open window. No promises were exchanged. No plans were made. Only a shared look between two people who had once dreamed of a life that neither of them had fully understood. He waited until she had walked a few steps before starting the engine. She did not look back. Not because she didn't care, but because she no longer needed to. She had come for clarity, and she had found it. The woman walking back toward the farmhouse was not the same girl who had once waited behind a barn door with a packed bag and trembling hands. She was stronger now, scarred but whole, shaped not by what had been taken from her, but by what she had reclaimed in its place. As the house came into view, its silhouette framed against the rising sun, Miriam felt a stillness settle over her. Her steps slowed. Her breath deepened. She knew the road would stretch out again, the choices would return, and life would test her in new ways. But she had walked into her past and returned on her own terms. And that, more than any love or loss, was the beginning of something unbreakable. The scissors had once tried to silence her. But now, with every step forward, Miriam wove a different kind of legacy, one that could not be cut. The morning after Miriam returned from the edge of the road, the house greeted her with the same creaks in the floorboards and scent of baked oats rising from the kitchen. But everything felt shifted, as if the stillness around her now had a different temperature. No one had seen her arrive. She had entered quietly, as always, her shoes light against the worn wooden steps, her dress damp from the early dew. Her mother was already asleep, the kerosene lamp in the hallway blown out, the house bathed in the hush of night surrendering to dawn. Miriam had crossed the threshold not as a daughter seeking shelter, but as a woman who had just laid to rest a version of herself buried at the tree line between two lives. The conversation with Alexander had not resolved anything in the way stories crave resolution. It had not offered redemption or rekindled romance. What it gave her instead was confirmation that her choice to remain had not been made from fear, but from clarity. In the following days, the rhythm of her world resumed its familiar cycle, rising before the sun, washing in the basin outside, braiding her growing hair beneath her cap, collecting eggs, and moving through the unspoken choreography of her duties. But within her, something had solidified. There was no more waiting. No more gazing down the road with quiet longing. She had done what few in her position ever could. She had returned to the place of rupture and stood still within it. She had looked into the face of the life that could have been hers and recognized its beauty and its weight. And she had chosen not to flee, but to stay. Not because the life before her was perfect, but because she understood now that the strength she had always sought beyond the fence had been quietly building inside her all along. Her mother observed her differently now. There was no spoken shift between them, no moment where the past was unpacked and made tender by conversation. But something passed in the way her mother handed her the folded linens, or lingered beside her while peeling potatoes in silence. There was a recognition, not of agreement, but of mutual burden. Both women had been raised under the same roof of rules, the same ceiling of silence, but Miriam had stepped into the storm where her mother had long ago learned to weather it from within. And perhaps, in her own quiet way, her mother was proud. Or perhaps, she was simply relieved that the fire had not consumed them both. The community, however, did not welcome her return with such subtle mercy. Though she had never truly left, whispers reignited quickly. It didn't take much. Just one person seeing her near the forest, another noticing the dirt on her hem from the gravel road, a third perhaps recognizing the sleek car parked just out of sight that morning. The story stitched itself back together without her consent. The bishop did not come knocking, but the judgment carried in the lowered voices during services and the withheld invitations to social gatherings made their point clearly enough. Miriam was no longer a pariah, but she was not forgiven either. She had become what the elders feared most, a woman who had tasted the possibility of another life and chosen to remain on her own terms. Children still played near her, but their mothers now called them back sooner. Her offers to help with quilting circles were met with polite refusals. Even her name was spoken less often, and when it was, it carried the edge of caution. But Miriam no longer burned with shame at their coldness. She had endured the severing of her identity once. Now she simply observed the world's discomfort with her presence, as though watching shadows drift across the barn wall. The weight no longer belonged to her. She moved through the village with quiet grace, not seeking acceptance but peace. Her strength was not in being understood, but in knowing she did not need to be. As autumn approached, the land changed colors, and so did the tone of Miriam's days. Her younger sister Ruth, now nearing the age of courtship, had begun to look at her with wide, questioning eyes. Ruth had always been observant, always curious. Now, that curiosity sharpened. One evening, as they folded linens in the attic, Ruth lingered after the others had gone. She did not ask about Alexander. She did not mention the road or the rumors. She only placed a single question between them, soft and trembling. Miriam answered not with names or details, but with a truth large enough for a younger heart to carry, that it was possible to survive love and silence, and still remain whole. Her words became a kind of quiet legacy, one passed not in story but in posture, in the way she moved through each task with intention and calm. Ruth began to mirror her movements, more watchful, more measured. Miriam saw the future forming in her sister's gaze, a longing she knew intimately. She did not warn her away. She simply made space for her to observe, to ask, to wonder. Because if anything good had come from her journey, it was the understanding that the fiercest inheritance she could offer was not obedience, but agency. The changing season brought more than falling leaves. It brought visits from distant relatives, gatherings for harvest meals, and opportunities for the community to subtly test Miriam's reintegration. She was invited to a supper gathering on the edge of the village, hosted by a family known for their rigidity and piety. The invitation was unexpected, but not unwelcome. Miriam accepted, knowing full well that it was not kindness that brought it to her door, but scrutiny. She dressed plainly, braided her hair carefully, and carried herself with the same quiet confidence she had forged through heartbreak. The supper passed without incident, but Miriam noted the way questions were laced with judgment, how every compliment veiled a probe, every smile stretched a little too tight. Still, she answered with honesty and nothing more. She had no need to defend herself. Her life was no longer on trial. Late that evening, as she walked home alone under a sky heavy with stars, she allowed herself to exhale the weight of performance. She had faced their questions. She had passed through their evaluations. But more importantly, she had remained unchanged. She still knew who she was. And for the first time in months, that was enough. Her steps were slow, not out of fear or fatigue, but out of reverence. For the path, for the silence, for the night that no longer frightened her. When she reached the house, her mother was waiting by the window, candlelight flickering in the pane. She did not scold or inquire. She simply nodded and returned to her knitting. Miriam stepped inside, removed her shoes, and sat beside her. No words passed between them, but a kind of peace settled in the space they shared. It was the peace of two women who had fought their own battles with silence and survived. And though the scissors had once cut deeply between them, now their presence beside each other mended something quietly with every passing hour. Miriam no longer marked her days by what she had lost. She no longer dreamed of rescue or reunion. Instead, she had begun to imagine a life shaped not by escape, but by quiet resistance. Not through defiance, but through persistence. Each breath, each task, each glance toward the horizon carried with it the full weight of a woman who had dared to choose, and who continued to choose, again and again, not what was easiest, but what was truest. And in that, she found not just healing, but a kind of freedom no fence could ever contain. The first frost of the season came early that year, coating the fields in a thin layer of silver before the sun had the chance to rise. Miriam stood at the back of the barn, her breath visible in the cold morning air, her fingers wrapped tightly around a bale of hay as she paused to watch the whitened horizon. The quiet was deeper in the cold, heavier, and yet it brought her a sense of comfort. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke, and the crispness of it cleared her thoughts in a way prayer never had. It had been months since she had seen Alexander, and in that time, her heart had settled into something stronger than memory. She no longer clung to the idea of love as rescue, or freedom as departure. What she clung to now was something quieter and heavier, the integrity of a life built from truth, not dreams. Her days had found a steadier rhythm. The community still watched her from a distance, their judgments now simmered into uneasy coexistence. She was not embraced, but she was no longer rejected. She had become something they could not define, neither fallen nor forgiven, neither returned nor gone. Miriam existed at the edge of their understanding, and that gave her room to breathe. She moved through her tasks with a precision that made her reliable, but it was her silence that kept her apart. They never heard her complain, never saw her cry, never caught her eyes lingering on the road again. To them, she was a woman who had been broken and tamed. But they didn't know that her silence was not surrender. It was the armor she had chosen, not out of fear, but out of clarity. Ruth had grown bolder under Miriam's shadow, asking more questions, staying longer by her side in the evenings. The girl's mind was restless, her hands skilled, her gaze sharp. Miriam had started to see in her sister the seeds of a rebellion that might come faster than her own had. She did not encourage it directly. There were limits to what could be said aloud under their roof, but she let her presence speak. She let her choices be seen. And Ruth, wise beyond her years, absorbed everything in silence, the way Miriam once had. It pained her to imagine Ruth facing the same judgment, the same scissors in her mother's hands, the same weight in her chest. But Miriam also knew that shielding her would do nothing. Only truth could prepare someone for what tradition tried to erase. The seasons continued their slow turn, and with winter approaching, the pace of life slowed. Chores took longer in the cold, and the gatherings grew smaller. At night, the lamps burned longer, and the stories shared became more precious in the warmth of small rooms. Miriam found herself watching her parents more closely in those moments, not out of resentment, but out of a need to understand them. Her father's sternness had softened with age, though he still held to scripture like a shield. Her mother, always more complex, seemed older than the years on her face. Her hands had grown thinner, her steps slower, and her eyes, though alert, carried the weariness of a woman who had learned to endure her own silences for too long. There were moments, brief, often unnoticed, when her mother's gaze lingered on Miriam as if seeing her for the first time, and in those moments, something passed between them that was deeper than forgiveness. It was recognition. Then, one evening as the snow began to fall, a letter arrived by stranger's hand. It was folded neatly, tied with twine, and marked only with Miriam's name. No one saw who delivered it. The man had slipped through the town quickly, gone before the dogs even barked. Miriam held the letter in her hands by the fire. The room around her silent save for the ticking of the wall clock and the crackle of the flames. She did not open it immediately. She waited until the others had gone to bed, until the lamps were dimmed and her mother's footsteps faded overhead. Then, with steady fingers, she untied the twine and unfolded the paper. Alexander's handwriting had changed slightly, more angular now, but still unmistakably his. The letter did not ask her to come. It did not plead or reminisce. It was a simple account of his father's passing and the estate left behind. He wrote of how strange it felt to be surrounded by everything that once belonged to a man he had never fully understood, and how in the silence of his new house, he had thought often of her, not with longing, but with clarity. He did not say he missed her. He said he respected her, and that if, one day, she ever wished to see what her voice sounded like in a place where it would not be silenced, she would be welcome. No gate, no questions, just a door that would remain unlocked. Miriam folded the letter slowly, her hands lingering on the paper as if absorbing its weight. She did not weep. She did not smile. She sat with it for hours, the fire slowly dimming to embers. The offer was not a rescue. It was not a test. It was an invitation, not into his world, but into her own. She did not sleep that night. Instead, she lay awake beneath the quilt her mother had sewn, staring at the ceiling, feeling her heart beat evenly beneath her ribs. There was no fear this time, only a question, and the slow forming of an answer. In the days that followed, Miriam moved through her routines as always. She did not speak of the letter. She did not act differently. But inside her, a decision was forming like a structure built beam by beam, slowly, with intention. She watched her world more closely, the strength of her mother's hands kneading dough, the laughter of children echoing in the snow, the way the men's voices changed when the bishop walked into a room. She loved this place, even when it did not love her back. But she also knew she could not remain half alive inside it forever. It wasn't the thought of wealth or freedom or even love that drew her toward the decision. It was the image of a life where silence was not survival, where her thoughts did not have to be buried beneath obedience, where her body and her voice belonged fully to herself. The letter had not broken her resolve. It had revealed it. And so, one night, as snow coated the earth in a blanket of untouched white, Miriam wrote her own letter. She addressed it not to Alexander, but to herself. A promise, a declaration, a map. She wrote of everything she had seen and felt, everything she had survived. She wrote not for escape, but for truth. And when she was done, she folded the letter and placed it inside the hymnal where her oldest entries lay. The place where the girl she once was had first dared to believe she could want more. The next morning, she awoke before the sun and began her chores as usual. But something in her movements had changed. She was no longer preserving her place within a world that mistrusted her. She was preparing to leave it, not in haste, not in rebellion, but in certainty. Her choice, once taken from her in silence, now returned to her in full. This time, she would not run. She would walk, straight-backed, steady, without apology, without fear. The first sign of her departure came not with a spoken word or a packed suitcase, but in the way Miriam stood at the edge of the orchard 3 days later, her face lifted toward the horizon as if waiting for something that only she could see. The air had turned bitter that morning, the kind of cold that froze breath midair and cracked the ground beneath each careful step. The trees were bare, their branches clawing at the sky, but Miriam looked steady and warm in her plain dress and wool cloak. Her hair, now past her shoulders, was braided neatly beneath her bonnet, its thickness a quiet reminder of everything she had once lost and since reclaimed. She held no letter, no map, no plan scribbled on paper. What she held was far less visible, yet far more enduring, a resolve sharpened by months of silence, reflection, and a love that had never needed to be loud to be real. Inside the house, her mother moved about the kitchen without hurry, preparing bread as she always had, her hands powdered with flour, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. But her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as though she too sensed the shift pressing in through the walls. She had watched her daughter more closely over the last few weeks, not out of suspicion, but with the quiet gaze of a woman who understood the weight of what was coming. She had seen it in Miriam's posture, in her eyes, in the care she took with every task, not as one trying to impress, but as one preparing to say goodbye with dignity. No confrontation had taken place. No second pair of scissors had been raised. There was only the gradual, undeniable current of a decision fully matured. By mid-morning, Miriam gathered her things. Not in haste, not in secret. She folded only what she needed, a few garments, a journal, a single photograph she had tucked into a hymnal long ago. She left the rest untouched, not out of rejection, but because she understood that some things belonged to a chapter that had ended. She moved about the room with reverence, her hands brushing across the wooden bed frame, the windowsill where she had once watched for his car, the braided rug where she had knelt in prayer as a child. Each item held memory, and she allowed herself to feel each one fully before releasing it. There was no bitterness in her departure, only a soft sorrow carried on strong shoulders. Her mother watched her descend the stairs, her eyes calm, her lips set in a line that betrayed neither resistance nor relief. She did not speak, but she did not look away. Miriam stepped into the kitchen and paused, waiting for something, a word, a gesture, a plea. None came. But her mother reached for the kettle and poured her a final cup of tea, placing it on the table without ceremony. Miriam sat, warmed her hands on the cup, and drank slowly. The silence between them was thick with all the words they would never say. And when she stood to leave, her mother placed a small linen-wrapped bundle into her hands. Bread. A final offering. A quiet benediction. Miriam walked to the edge of the property where the land dipped low and the trees thickened, the same path she had taken so many times before with hesitation and heartbreak. But this time, her pace was steady, her breath even. The letter from Alexander remained untouched in her pocket, not as a destination, but as a compass. She didn't know what city she would end up in, what room she would sleep in that night, or who would greet her on the other side. But she knew what she was walking away from. She knew what silence had cost her, and she knew, at last, what her voice sounded like when it rose above obedience. As the road came into view, she felt the wind push against her back, firm but gentle, like the hand of time itself urging her forward. A car waited at the bend, not his this time, but arranged by someone he trusted. She had agreed to the terms days ago in a single line sent through a messenger. No farewell, no explanation. Only a sentence that said, "I will walk forward." The driver stepped out, nodded, and opened the door. She paused only once, long enough to look back at the house that had both raised and bound her. The smoke rose softly from the chimney. The fields lay still. She imagined her mother standing again at the window, but she did not look to confirm it. Some things are better left in sacred uncertainty. She climbed into the car and closed the door. The engine rumbled to life, steady and sure, and the wheels began to turn. The road stretched long ahead, quiet and open, and for the first time, she did not brace against its length. She let her head rest against the window and closed her eyes. There was no fear now, no frantic heartbeat, no second guessing. Only the gentle rhythm of movement and the knowledge that this time, she was not being taken. She was going, not toward a man, not away from a mother, but into herself, into the life she had waited too long to begin. As the car disappeared into the distance, the snow began to fall again, soft and unannounced, blanketing the road behind her in white. And in the house she had left behind, a mother stood silently in the kitchen, holding the empty teacup in her hands. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply turned to the window, placed the cup back on the shelf, and began kneading the dough once more, the rhythm familiar, the silence deeper than ever. Miriam's story did not end with romance or return. It did not resolve with reunion or revenge. It became something else entirely, a quiet declaration that love, when stifled, transforms. That silence, when endured, reshapes the soul. And that a woman, once stripped of choice, can find in herself the strength to build a new one from nothing but memory, pain, and the will to walk on her own 2 feet. If you were moved by this journey, by Miriam's silence, her strength, her decision, then we ask you to support stories like this by subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us bring forward more voices that have been quieted, more lives that deserve to be told, and more truths that need space to breathe. Don't let this be the last story you feel. Click subscribe, and stay with us as we uncover the stories that live between the fences.